So now that we got a good understanding of conflict and conflict resolution, it's important that we look at negotiation. Now, negotiation is sometimes referred to as bargaining, and it's a process where people involved. Okay, now that we have a good understanding of conflict and conflict resolution, it's important that we look at negotiation. Now, negotiation is a process in which two parties are exchanging goods or services and attempt to agree on an exchange rate for them. Okay, that's one definition. We can also think of negotiation as a process where people involved with some kind of conflict work on creating a deal that's mutually beneficial. Okay, so these different definitions, whether they involve exchanging goods or services or being mutually beneficial, kind of describe these two general approaches of distributive bargaining and integrative bargaining. Okay, distributive bargaining seeks to divide up the fixed amount of resources and often creates a win-lose situation. Again, when the issue of conflict involves resources, tangible resources, it's often hard to avoid distributive bargaining. Integrative bargaining seeks one or more settlements that can create a win-win situation for all parties involved. So sometimes there may be some creative, innovative solution where both parties can be at advantage, and that's a win-win solution. So this slide describes the differences between distributive bargaining and integrative bargaining a little bit more. So in terms of their goal, when you're doing distributive bargaining, you want as much as you can get. In integrative bargaining, it's about expanding the pie, like growing the business, and then everybody can get more. So another characteristic of negotiating or bargaining is motivation. In distributive bargaining, we want to win and make them lose. In integrative bargaining, it's win-win. When we're looking at the focus of bargaining with distributive, it's about your positions. In integrative bargaining, it's more about interests and looking at shared interests or finding shared interests. In terms of information sharing, it's usually very low in distributive bargaining, but it's required to be very high in terms of integrative bargaining. So how you communicate is very important in integrative bargaining. And in terms of the duration of the relationship, distributive bargaining is usually kind of short term. Integrative bargaining is more long term. Now, when we think of the negotiation process, we need to think about different stages of negotiation, and they include preparation and planning, defining the ground rules, clarification and justification, bargaining and problem solving, and then finally closure and implementation. You should determine the positions of both yourself and the other party in terms of BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Basically, a BATNA is kind of your walk away point. Okay, it's the bottom line for negotiations. It's the lowest acceptable value to an individual for a negotiated agreement. Okay, now this certainly isn't where you want to start. Okay, but you got to know where you're willing to walk away, and you got to have a sense where the other party is going to walk away. Recently deceased singer Kenny Rogers used to sing, "You got to know when to hold them and you got to know when to fold them." And that has a lot to do in negotiation with your BATNA. Now, there's a bit of research on individual differences in negotiation effectiveness, and some of it has to do with personality traits, others with mood and emotion, and then there's also research on gender differences. In terms of personality traits, it seems that extroverts tend to be weaker at negotiation because they want the people who listen to them to like them. It's good in negotiation to not care. if the other side likes you or not. Intelligence is, interestingly, not a very good indicator of effective negotiation skills. Very interesting. In terms of mood and emotion, it can impact negotiations. Emotions such as anger can be an effective tool in distributive bargaining, but more positive moods are necessary in an integrative bargaining situation. Men and women tend to approach negotiations in the same way, but may view outcomes differently. Women tend to appear more tender to others, and men come across as more tough. What does that mean? It means that people have stereotypes and they affect their perceptions. On the average, men are more likely to be negotiators than women. Okay, but that's a good thing to change, because it's being good at negotiation is being good about getting the outcomes that you want. And so hopefully we see more and more women being negotiators. Certainly, in my experience, both in a business setting and outside of business setting, women are often very effective negotiators because they are effective at building relationships and communicating expectations. And those two things can lead to effective negotiation outcomes. Oftentimes, a third party is needed during the negotiation process. There might be the use of a mediator who's a neutral third party helping to facilitate a negotiated solution by using reasoning and persuasion and suggesting alternatives. Mediators generally tend to manage the process. An arbitrator helps negotiate solutions but has authority to dictate an agreement. A conciliator may also be brought in who's a trusted third party, someone who both parties trust, to provide informal communication that might bring together two parties that are having kind of relationship conflicts. A consultant can be used, such as a skilled conflict manager, in an attempt to create creative problem solving situations through structured problem solving exercises. As you might imagine, there are many global implications for how we negotiate. Culture is very likely to affect how we approach negotiation. For example, Japanese and U.S. managers view conflict very differently. U.S. managers are more likely to use competitive tactics, where Japanese managers are more likely to use compromise or avoidance. And we see that there's culture differences in negotiations. American negotiators are more likely than Japanese bargainers to make the first offer. I always like to make the first offer because it defines the playing field. North Americans tend to use facts to persuade. People from the Middle East tend to use more emotion, and Russians tend to assert more ideals and values. Interestingly enough, Brazilians say no more than Americans and Japanese. So some very interesting research on these global implications. Certainly another thing to think back to is Hofstede's model of cultural values, and many of those different distinct cultural values have implications for how people in different cultures approach conflict and negotiations.